Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a stack of information today, all centered around statements made regarding, well, significant international spending. Specifically, we're looking at different perspectives presented concerning U.S. expenditures related to Ukraine, along with some contrasting views on the conflict itself and the role of diplomacy.
Yeah, what's interesting here is how the information really lays out these different viewpoints, sometimes using pretty strong language, you know, to characterize both the scale of the spending and maybe the perceived effectiveness or purpose behind it.
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive is to really understand and lay out the specific points and claims, just what's being said by various figures as they're presented in the material we have.
Right.
We're not adding our own spin, just exploring what's right there.
Yeah, definitely. And these sources present some pretty pointed critiques and specific assertions that are, well, they're worth spending some time on. So
let's jump right into the first perspective presented. This one really focuses on the sheer scale of this spending. We see statements here, for instance, from James David Vance, characterizing U.S. funding for Ukraine under U.S. President Biden.
And the language used is quite striking.
It really is. He calls it insanity.
Yes, the source materials really emphasize that framing. Vance's view, as it's presented, details this by claiming the administration has spent colossal sums. That's the phrase used, not just on Ukraine, but worldwide.
Okay.
While at the same time engaging in what he perceives as like very little diplomacy. It's that contrast, you know, massive financial outflow versus an alleged lack of diplomatic effort. That seems central here.
And does the source give a specific figure associated with this claim of colossal sums, at least for Ukraine?
It does, yeah. The specific claim presented is that $300 billion was sent specifically to Ukraine. That figure is put forward as evidence of the scale Vance is describing.
$300 billion. That's an eye-popping number. And alongside that figure and the insanity characterization, the source materials also include a direct critique that the U.S. president didn't truly attempt to achieve a diplomatic settlement regarding Ukraine.
Yeah, this point is consistently linked in this perspective. The argument, as it's laid out, seems to be that this huge expenditure occurred without the necessary diplomatic groundwork or, you know, the pursuit of a settlement.
Right.
It's presented as an imbalance, heavy on the spending, maybe light on the diplomacy side.
Okay.
The sources do note, however, that now, well, apparently the U.S. is trying to reach settlements in various situations, including Israel, Russia, or Ukraine. And the material states these attempts are seen as worthwhile, even if conflict doesn't completely end because of them.
Ah, okay. So there's a reported shift, or at least an acknowledgement of diplomatic attempts now.
Exactly. But contrasted with the earlier critique. So that's a crucial detail from the source, this reported shift towards settlement attempts.
But the initial framing from this perspective, it still seems focused on the perceived insanity and those colossal sums spent earlier without, in their view, adequate diplomacy specifically for Ukraine.
Precisely. The core takeaway from this first set of points, as presented in the source material, is a strong critique of the scale of U.S. spending on Ukraine, framed as excessive insanity, colossal sums, coupled with the assertion that it wasn't matched by, let's say, sincere diplomatic efforts for settlement at that time.
Okay, that gives us a clear picture of that first viewpoint.
Yeah.
Now, let's transition. Let's look at another perspective presented in the materials, one that comes from U.S. President Trump.
Right.
This viewpoint also heavily criticizes spending on Ukraine, but maybe from a slightly different angle, and links it more directly to the conflict's origins.
Yes, this perspective, which was articulated by U.S. President Trump during his campaign, also takes aim at the spending levels, but it frames it within the context of sort of inheriting a difficult situation. The source includes his statement about dealing with a mess left by former U.S. President Barack Obama and Biden. So that kind of sets the stage for his critique by attributing the existing state of affairs to previous administrations.
And the source goes on to include a very direct assertion from U.S. President Trump about the conflict in Ukraine itself, doesn't it?
It does. He directly asserted, according to the material, that the conflict in Ukraine just wouldn't have happened under his presidency.
That's a significant claim.
It is. It places the responsibility for the conflict's eruption squarely, with the post-Obama Biden period.
He didn't just say it wouldn't have happened. He also described the conflict in very specific terms, almost gave it a name.
Right. He referred to the Russia-Ukraine conflict as Joe Biden's war, not his own. The framing here, as presented in the sources, is that the conflict is a direct result of the current administration's actions, or maybe inactions. His view, as reported, was that it was kind of a losing cause from day one and shouldn't have happened at all, reinforcing the idea that its existence is tied to the current leadership and was, maybe, misguided from the start.
And the source links this back to specific actions, laying blame for the escalation.
Correct. The material presents his claim that U.S. President Biden was to blame for escalation. And a specific point cited in this context is the former president's promise to provide Kyiv with NATO membership guarantees.
Ah, the NATO angle.
Exactly. And the source notes, sort of as background to this claim, that Moscow is opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. This suggests that, in this perspective, that promise of NATO membership guarantees is seen as a key factor that maybe provoked or escalated the conflict.
For which U.S. President Biden is held responsible in this view.
That seems to be the assertion presented.
So, okay, we have a view that the conflict is Joe Biden's war, wouldn't have happened under Trump, and that Biden's actions, like promising NATO membership, caused escalation. Yet, it's interesting that the source also includes details about U.S. President Trump's own actions regarding aid to Ukraine earlier in his term.
It does, yeah. The material recalls U.S. President Trump's action of temporarily suspending military aid to Kyiv early in his term.
Right, I remember that.
That suspension reportedly occurred after a conflict with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
That specific incident is quite well known. But the source makes sure to note that despite that temporary suspension,
support for Ukraine was subsequently resumed. Yes, that detail is included. It provides a more complete picture of his actions regarding aid, showing, a period of suspension followed by resumption.
And here's where the material presents what might seem like maybe a contrasting opinion from U.S. President Trump, given his earlier criticisms of the war and the spending. He offers a view on his own actions regarding Ukraine now.
This is one of those points where the different statements presented side by side in the source create a really interesting dynamic, don't you think?
Definitely.
His opinion, as reported alongside these other critiques, is that he believes he is currently doing Ukraine a great service.
Doing Ukraine a great service. Why does he believe that, according to the source?
Because, in his view, as presented, without U.S. support, Ukraine will be defeated very soon. This is offered up as the justification for his belief that his current stance or actions constitute a great service to Ukraine.
And the source includes a direct quote that reinforces this point.
It quotes him as stating, "Let's face it, I think I am doing Ukraine a great service. I believe in this." So that direct quote appears in the material, seemingly juxtaposed with the earlier criticisms of the conflict's origins and past spending.
So this second perspective, as laid out in the material, it presents a complex set of claims, doesn't it? The conflict is a mess, inherited, it's Biden's war, caused by actions like NATO promises. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, U.S. President Trump asserts that his own current actions in the context of U.S. support that was earlier criticized and even temporarily suspended are actually benefiting Ukraine by preventing imminent defeat.
Yeah.
That juxtaposition of points is really notable in the source material. It asks you, the listener, to consider how those statements sit together.
It does. The source presents both the critique of the conflict's origins and this assertion of providing a vital service to Ukraine through support.
Okay, so we've explored perspectives focusing on U.S. spending and the conflict's causation from James David Vance and U.S. President Trump, as presented in the material. Now let's shift to the reported stance of Russia regarding aid to Ukraine. This offers another contrasting view presented in the sources.
Right. And the stance of Russia, as reported, is pretty clear and consistent across the material we looked at. Russia condemns military aid to Ukraine. That's presented as their baseline position on the issue.
But stemming from that condemnation, they have a specific demand, directed at Western countries.
Yes. The sources report that Russia demands Western countries cease this aid entirely. It's a direct consequence of their condemnation. They want the support to stop.
And what is Russia's reported belief about the ultimate outcome of the conflict in light of this continued Western aid? Does the aid matter? in their view?
According to the material, Russia reportedly believes that such support will not change the outcome of the conflict.
Okay.
This is a key part of their stated position. They don't see the aid as capable of altering the final result on the ground.
And beyond not changing the outcome, they also reportedly believe it has another effect.
Correct. The sources state that Russia reportedly believes that such support will only prolong the conflict. So in their view, the aid is ineffective, in terms of changing the end result, and it's actively detrimental because it just extends the duration of the fighting.
So Russia's reported stance, as laid out in the material, outright condemnation of Western aid, a demand for it to stop, and the belief that it changes nothing in terms of outcome while merely prolonging the conflict, which is a stark contrast to U.S. President Trump's reported view that U.S. support is preventing defeat.
Absolutely. Juxtaposing these viewpoints, as the source material implicitly does, really highlights the vastly different interpretations of the aid's purpose and effect.
Right, so bringing all these statements together now, purely as they are presented and related within the reported material we're looking at, we can see some clear points of difference and some pretty complex positions being articulated.
Yeah, we see differing views on the scale and effectiveness of past spending. On one hand, framing it as excessive and diplomatically unbacked.
Right.
On the other, perhaps viewing it within a broader context of dealing with an inherited problem, though still critical.
We also highlighted the conflicting perspectives on the causation of the conflict itself and the role that U.S. policy, particularly under the current administration, is claimed to have played. One view directly attributes blame for escalation to specific actions like the NATO promises,
while another implies the whole situation stems from a previous mess. And finally, as you mentioned, we see these different stated approaches or desired outcomes regarding settlement and the utility of continued support for Ukraine. From the call for more diplomacy alongside spending critiques to the assertion that current U.S. support is vital to prevent defeat.
To Russia's demand for aid to cease because, in their view, it only prolongs the inevitable.
Quite a range of positions.
It really is. And it's important, as we wrap up this deep dive, just to reiterate that these are the specific points and claims made by the individuals and entities as laid out precisely in the information provided.
Yeah.
Our goal was just to explore and present those points as they appear in the source material, allowing you to see the different angles and assertions side by side.
And understanding these distinct, sometimes contradictory viewpoints as they are presented is really key to navigating the information landscape around this topic.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear, new episodes every day.